Those are the top stories this hour. One of them, of course, is about the basic income grant. And now we know with the unemployment figures at record highs amid this pandemic that's exacerbating the situation, calls for a basic or universal, rather, basic income grant are growing stronger. The question remains, though, how much will it cost the fiscus and where will the money come from? Or can we afford not to have a basic income grant? South Africa's largest business organization, BUSA, says we simply cannot afford it. Social anthropologist Dr. Nosipho Mngomezulu from Wits University is joining me now just to have a discussion on this matter. Dr. Mngomezulu, good afternoon. Welcome to the Midday View this hour. All the time when I speak about the basic income grant on eNCA, it's about the money. How much is it going to cost? Can we afford it? And so, but it is, of course, about the money. We know that. But there's an important question here. Can we not afford to have it?
No, certainly. I think that the question of thinking solely about what the money situation is to only think about this as only a technical issue. But I think we need to maybe start mobilizing our fiscal imagination to consider and think about what is at stake if such a grant or such processes aren't put in place to start really dealing with the enormous indignities of inequality and poverty in South Africa.
What would be at stake? And I'm asking this in the context of the numbers of unemployed in South Africa. Majority are young people, and half of that big number of young people who are unemployed, if not just over half, are young women.
I mean, part of my work is to consider work on the continent in our continent, we are an increasingly young continent, right? We have an African youth bulge, as it's often referred to. And our interest is often in paying attention to young people, either when they're in danger or we consider them to be dangerous. But we pay very little attention to how young people are already making lives livable under precarious conditions. We pay very little attention to the innovations that young people are already making in the informal sector. And I think when we start thinking only of the technocratic element of money, we fail to consider the real social import of what young people are doing on this continent, which is its current situation and its future, that young people are already the people who are shaping our current context. And I really think that we need to rethink the application of our thinking in terms of only unemployment, but also to consider, very importantly, what devastating situations young people are in when they are underemployed, and how something like the Universal Basic Income Grant can really start to bridge some of those gaps between those who are underemployed and those also who are not employed.
I mean, the grant is not a lot of money. Okay, we don't know where it's going to be sitting at. I mean, from what I've seen and reading some of other people's research, it's like it needs to be closer to that poverty line threshold of the amount of money that might be needed. I mean, that extra 350 rand that's been given under this temporary COVID-19 relief fund has been welcomed, but many activists argue it is nothing. But what can a young person or anybody actually do with such, let me call it, little money, according to many people? Can it really benefit?
I mean, sure, the money is little. And I mean, I am not an economist, and so I don't know how to slice the fiscal pie. But what I do understand in terms of the conversations that we've been having both in the academy and also in social justice spaces is to consider this grant not necessarily as some kind of full-blown salary, but to really make a disruption to the unequal distribution of economic growth and the inequality that is faced in this country. So it is merely to stop the indignities of poverty, but it is certainly not going to be enough to deal with some of the larger structural problems that we need to be thinking about. And, some of those structural problems, include the question of transgenerational transfer of wealth, that if we have an increasingly young population and the majority of this country is transferring wealth not from parents to children, but from children to parents, the misnomer of black tax. We need to seriously consider what are the structural conditions that are creating such indignities of poverty and inequality in this country. And maybe the experiment with the universal basic income grant could be some part of alleviating some of those indignities. So it is certainly not going to be a fix-all solution, but it is definitely offering a social safety net that can really hold people against, dire situations of poverty.
What about dissenting voices that say a universal basic income grant will create or perpetuate the syndrome of dependency?
Oh, man. I would say that, dependency is kind of a rhetoric that is used to skirt some very important historical conversations that we need to have. Dependency is often set up against a context that doesn't pay attention to power or historical context. This country has suffered some devastating structural violence in the form of colonialism, in the form of apartheid, that has systematically disempowered and disenfranchised people and for generations. And so for me, when I hear people holding up dependency, I find it to be quite an unimaginative critique of universal basic income. I don't think dependency is really a problem that we are meant to be focusing on. In my experience working with social justice organizations and within the development space, there's a discourse on asset-based development practice. And it's not just a discourse, rather, it's a practice where we can start to think of UBI as supplementing already existing assets, the already existing imaginaries and already existing strategies that people have put in place. But it's very hard for you to become an entrepreneur in the formal or informal sector if all you're thinking about is how you're going to get transport, who's going to do childcare, if there's any kind of emergency funding to bolster against any unexpected occurrences that need a quick cash injection. So I definitely don't think dependency is the primary question that we need to be focusing on, because it has the danger of putting us in an ahistorical conversation where we are no longer actually treating individuals as descendants and people who are continuously living with the legacies of structural violence. We're treating them as if they're people who woke up in the morning, suddenly didn't have a job, and we need to now suddenly give them cash injection. We need to start thinking about this as being a intervention that has been precipitated by our historical circumstances, and it is quite urgent.
Okay, quite urgent indeed. Dr. Mngomezulu, I'm just going to give you less than 1 minute, in fact, just as we conclude an opportunity. If you were in the room right now with Lindiwe Zulu, the Minister of Social Development, who told me on eNCA a few months ago, the government and the governing party, eNCA, are looking at this proposal of a universal basic income grant, what would you be saying to her to make sure that it happens? Because currently there's a discussion about it, but from your arguments you are making, we need it.
We certainly do need it. And I really do applaud that government is taking these proposals quite seriously and is really trying to make an intervention in kind of alleviating the indignities of poverty. I think the most important thing that I might want to share with the minister is that money is a very technocratic issue. We can find the money if there is enough political will or urgency to actually do this kind of project. And I think really paying attention to the incredible work that young people are already doing in social justice organization, in non-governmental institutions and community-based organizations, and to recognize the immense amount of creativity, the immense amount of will to really participate in the building and shaping of this country, and to really look to that as the real spaces of giving us some kinds of clues about how we might model something like a UBI in South Africa. Because I certainly don't believe that we are so unimaginative as to only be stuck on the question of affordability. I really think that social transformation is something that we can still put back on the political table and really engage with some of the structural violence that requires remediation in this country. UBI is a far cry from some of the largest structural interventions that have been called for in South Africa, but it is one step towards justice, and to pay attention to these projects and engagements that young people are already participating in both the formal and informal sector in this country to really build our society.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nosipho Mngomezulu. Pleasure talking to you. I'm sure we'll talk again in the near future. She's a social anthropologist and lecturer at Wits University, making a very strong case there, and it sounds sensible and reasonable to me. It's not just about the money.